from Zoom in just a few seconds. We'll be hearing from our YouTube readers, and they've now joined us. Greetings. My name is Dr. David Downing, the co-director of the Marion E. Wade Center, and I'm delighted today to be hosting a book launch of Dr. Michael Ward's After Humanity, a guide to C.S. Lewis's Abolition of Man. So he's joining us from Oxford, hence the unusual time for our presentation today. I'm also here with Marjorie Lant-Mead, the Associate Director of the Wade Center, who has been a co-editor of some of Lewis's favorite books, including Letters to Children and Warren's journal, Brothers and Friends. She has been a servant leader at the Wade Center since the era of Clyde S. Kilby. So welcome, Marge, and thank you for being my co-host and curator of some questions from the audience. We'll be hearing from Michael first, and then Marge and I will be starting out with a few questions that we have for him, and then we're going to open things up to you, the audience. So feel free to type questions into the Q&A box, not the chat box, that's for different purposes, but type them into the Q&A box. And then as we wrap up after about an hour, I'll announce a couple of winners of copies of the pair of books, both The Abolition of Man, the new edition that just came out as a companion to Michael's book, and also After Humanity. So that will be a couple of book winners right near the end of the session. Michael, thank you for joining us today at rather late hour for you. Michael is a senior research fellow at Blackfriars Hall in the University of Oxford and a professor of apologetics at Houston Baptist University. He's the author of the best-selling and award-winning book, Planet Narnia, and the co-editor of the Cambridge Companion to C.S. Lewis. Apart from his academic work, Ward is a Catholic priest assisting at Hingsty Parish in Oxford. He's also an actor upon occasion. He handed a pair of X-ray spectacles to Pierce Brosnan in a James Bond film, and he plays the part of C.S. Lewis's vicar in the upcoming film, The Most Reluctant Convert, starring Max McLean. So, Michael, I'm hoping you will take the part of Elrond in some of the upcoming Middle-earth dramas on Amazon. So I hope to see more of those talents developed as the years come on. But today, excuse me?
Thank you. I think I need another kind of wig to play Elrond. They gave me a wig to play C.S. Lewis's vicar. Given my current baldness, I think I'm probably best suited to play Gollum.
Okay. Well, let me turn things over to you to give an overview of the book. And then when you're finished giving a summary and some of your comments about why you wrote the book, we'll have Marge and I ask you a few questions, then we'll open things up to our listeners and our viewers. So thank you for joining us, Michael.
Thank you, David. Thank you, Marge. It's great to be with you, albeit in only 2 dimensions. I'm very grateful to the Wade Center. This is the second time you have allowed me to launch a book under your auspices. Back in 2008, it was at the Wade Center that I launched Planet Narnia. And here I am again. How many years later is that? What's 13 years later? Something like that. And thank you very much. And not only for the launch pad, as it were, but also for the various images that you have given me permission to reproduce in After Humanity. It comes with a glorious photo gallery, I'm pleased to say, in marvelous Technicolor. And some of these images are in the archives at the Wade Center and are being published here for the very first time. So thank you very much for that. But to get into what I think will probably be a 15-minute little sort of introductory talk about this guide that I've written. First of all, we need to remind ourselves what it is a guide to. After Humanity, a guide to C.S. Lewis's The Abolition of Man. And The Abolition of Man is not one of Lewis's best known works. Even those who may be familiar with the title may not be familiar with the contents. And even those who have read the contents may not have made much of them, because it is a very dense and some might even say impenetrable book. It's certainly one of his more philosophical. It's a purely philosophical work, actually, and it originated as a series of lectures that he gave at the University of Durham during the Second World War. So he was operating at a top flight academic context when he first delivered these lectures, and he knew that he could be asked questions by the audience afterwards if they didn't understand anything. If you want the more accessible version of The Abolition of Man, the best place to look is actually Mere Christianity. The first 4 chapters of Mere Christianity operate as a kind of popularization of the ideas that he expresses in The Abolition of Man. So it's a difficult work, and that's one of the reasons why I've written this guide. That as I have myself tried to teach, well, first of all, tried to understand for myself The Abolition of Man, and then tried to teach it to my students over the years, I've noticed that a lot of preparatory work needs to be done, just sort of clearing out misconceptions and making clear the basic substance of the book, even before you begin to try to engage with it or grapple with it. So in After Humanity, I'm attempting to do 3 things. I'm trying to establish what Lewis said, why he said it, and how he did so. What he said, let's just try and make sure we understand all the words, including the many difficult phrases in Latin and Greek and French. Just occasionally in The Abolition of Man, Lewis is rather uncharacteristically obscure. So I've tried to iron out those wrinkles as well. What he said, let's get that on the page first. Why did he say it? So I've got some background context. I look at the historical circumstances and some of the personal conditions that helped give rise to the book. Why he thought that it was so necessary to tackle these ideas. And then the third section of the book, the third element of the book is how did Lewis say these things? So I'm looking, you know, more as a literary critic at the style and the rhetoric and the mode of presentation within The Abolition of Man. That's what my guide is trying to establish. I'm not myself a philosopher, and I'm not trying to demonstrate that Lewis's own arguments are correct or incorrect or a mixture of the two. I mean, I introduce my own judgments about particular paragraphs and sentences, and I try to establish whether those are right or wrong, you know, in terms of presentation. But the substance of the argument is not something I'm actually grappling with. The substance of the argument is value objective or not? When we say that things are right or wrong, are we merely recording some sort of personal subjective preference, some private whim or some opinion, mere opinion, or are we recognizing some kind of reality in the world outside us, which could not have been otherwise and which all reasonable people will acknowledge? Now, Lewis, of course, is trying to defend the objectivity of value. He's arguing against subjectivism. So when people ask, what is the abolition of man about? One can say it is a defense of the objectivity of value. But it's also, as some people have pointed out, a reductio ad absurdum. Lewis is taking the subjectivist principle and pursuing it, trying to see where it leads to. If you did believe sincerely that value was subjective, entirely made up out of your own arbitrary whims and preferences, where would that take you? Where would that take humanity as a whole? It would take us to destruction, is Lewis's basic argument. It would erase what makes us peculiarly human. So some people have said that The Abolition of Man is really a work of philosophical anthropology. He is trying to establish what it is that makes us human beings from an ethical point of view. And his answer is recognition of objective value, which we didn't make up, we just discover it. It's like the truths of mathematics. We recognize them as objective realities out there. They could not have been otherwise. So it's both a defense and a reductio. If we follow subjectivism, we will result in the abolition of man. We will either descend into a kind of animality, or we will evaporate into pure spirituality, which is not necessarily a good thing for human beings because we are embodied creatures. To be purely cerebral is to be, well, it's to be like the angels or very possibly like the demons. Not that he gets into those questions in The Abolition of Man. The Abolition of Man is a purely philosophical work, as I say. It's not a theological work. It's not a work of Christian apologetics. And that is another thing that I'm trying to make clear in After Humanity, that we shouldn't assume that just because Lewis, the great Christian apologist, is the author of this book, that therefore it's straightforward Christian apologetics. On the contrary, Lewis says in the course of his argument, though I am myself a theist and indeed a Christian, I'm not attempting here any even indirect argument for theism. And the question of a supernatural, a divine origin for objective value is not a question that he goes into in these pages. It's a very short book, really. It's a thin volume. It's only, three short philosophical lectures. He can't cover very much ground. So he leaves theology, he leaves his own Christian commitments off stage almost entirely. And this again is another thing I tried to bring out in my guide, that if you are alive to Lewis's Christian commitments, you can see them even here, but subtly. He's keeping them latent, really. They are there for those with eyes to see. Now, C.S. Lewis described The Abolition of Man as almost my favorite among my books. That's no small claim, given how many books he wrote. The Abolition of Man is almost my favorite among my books. And that's one of the reasons, again, why we need a guide to it, I think, because if it's so favored by Lewis, we would do well to understand it very thoroughly. And it's not just Lewis who thinks like that. Walter Hooper, the late lamented Walter Hooper, described The Abolition of Man as an all but indispensable introduction to the entire corpus of Lewisiana. And other critics have described it as the linchpin for understanding all Lewis's works. So it's a very central text, a difficult text, but central and therefore requiring our close attention. I mentioned that Mere Christianity, the opening chapters of Mere Christianity, give a kind of popularization of the argument of the abolition of man. That Hideous Strength, the third volume in his Ransom trilogy, gives a fictionalization, a dramatization of the arguments of the abolition of man. And those are just the two most obvious areas in Lewis's other works where you see the centrality of these ideas being worked out. Why did he think it was so central? Why did he favor it so much? I think, well, one of the reasons is that he himself, in his early years, in his teens and early 20s, he himself seems to have grappled with the lure of subjectivism himself. In his autobiography, Surprised by Joy, he talks about his own vicious subjectivism. He talks about how his mind, the two hemispheres of his mind were in sharpest contrast with each other. On the one hand, he faced, he said, a world of facts without one trace of value. But from another point of view, he faced a world of feelings without one trace of truth or falsehood. So this fact-value opposition plagued him in his own early years, and trying to resolve the facts and the values, trying to find a way of uniting them, is, I think, one of the personal and existential processes that he went through in those early years, which find form in the argument of the abolition of man. So it speaks to his own personal philosophical development. You know, he's not just creaming off ideas from the top of his head. He's giving us something that he has himself struggled with. And another reason why it's of personal importance to Lewis, I think, is to do with his own experience during the First World War. The distinguished historian of Victorian England, G.M. Young, said that if you want to understand a famous figure from the past, a good question to ask yourself is what was going on in the world when that person was 20 years old. This is a line, incidentally, which is often misattributed to Napoleon Bonaparte. But what was going on in the world when Lewis was 20 years old? The First World War was just coming to a conclusion. Lewis turned 20 in November 1918, the very month that the armistice of the Great War was signed. He had seen men die. He had very nearly died himself in that conflict. His close friend Paddy Moore had died, and as a result, the whole course of Lewis's life was changed because Lewis had made a promise that he would look after Paddy Moore's mother and sister, and he went on to live with them for decades. The whole course of his life was different as a result of that death from during the First World War of Paddy Moore. And incidentally, another thing I found, which has never been published before, is a photograph of both Lewis and Moore in uniform in the officers' training corps. Here's the photograph. And although the photograph has been published before, it hasn't been published before with both men identified in it. And I've also got a photograph there of Paddy Moore's own gravestone, kindly given to me by Jerry Root of Wheaton College, who also gave me this Time magazine cover with Lewis on the front. I have so much to thank the Wade for. What's this got to do with the abolition of man? Well, one of the tests of the objectivity of value, Lewis argues, is pain and suffering. Death for a good cause, death for one's friends, death in battle, that's not subjectively pleasurable to the person undergoing the death or the pain, but that doesn't mean that it's not an objectively good thing to sacrifice oneself. Self-sacrifice is the experimentum crucis, the crucial or critical experiment of the objectivity of value. So when Lewis was 20, he was facing these questions at the most fundamental level. You know, he very nearly died himself. Close friends died. Had their death been in vain? Did it have any objective value? He had to wrestle with that. And 20 or so years later, it issues in The Abolition of Man. So these are important questions important considerations to bear in mind when we consider how the abolition of man has been received. It's issued from a deep part of himself, and as a result has a kind of poetic charge, you might say. I don't mean that it's written in verse. On the contrary, it's written in very dense prose. But Lewis's fellow Irishman, the great poet W.B. Yeats, once said, we make out of the quarrel with others rhetoric, but of the quarrel with ourselves poetry. We make out of the quarrel with others rhetoric, but of the quarrel with ourselves poetry. Now, Lewis had, as it were, been quarreling with himself about subjectivism and about the value of self-sacrificial death. He'd been quarreling with himself about that, and he'd come out the other side. He'd achieved a resolution of those issues. And as a result, what he produces in The Abolition of Man is a deeply poetic work. It sings. It's got harmonies and resonances and all those intangible musical poetic qualities which we recognize in a great work of genius. It's a poetic work from that point of view, but also poetic in the sense that it's just very well written. Though I've said it's dense and difficult, don't think that it's a thicket of polysyllabic philosophical terminology. Lewis is far too good a writer for that, and he makes his argument very concrete. He talks about waterfalls and heads and chests and bellies and geldings and windows and all these very imaginable, sensible, concrete realities by means of which we can take in the draft of his ideas. So it's a poetic work, It's a personal work. It's a prophetic philosophical work. And its legacy has been long-lasting and very widely admired too. This is one of the impressive things about it. There's a very prominent contemporary British philosopher, John Gray, an atheist as it happens, who thinks very highly of the abolition of man. He's described it as prescient, prophetic, as relevant now, if not more so than it was when it first came out. John Gray, recently devoted a whole BBC radio program to discussing the abolition of man. But Christians of every stripe have valued it highly too. Think of another Wheaton figure, former Wheaton professor Alan Jacobs, now at Baylor, an evangelical Anglican, who has described the abolition of man as possibly the profoundest of all Lewis's cultural critiques. Cardinal Joseph Ratzinger, who later, of course, became Pope Benedict XVI, has praised the keen accuracy of Lewis's moral diagnosis in this argument. So unbelievers and believers across the spectrum think very highly of this book. It's another reason why we would do well to understand it. Any book that can command such a wide range of interest and support must be doing something right, one would think. And another thing to mention when we are assessing its legacy, and with this I'll stop, is how timely Lewis's argument now seems in this post-truth world that we now live in. His defense of the objectivity of value is seeming all the more important. And I want to end by quoting the work of Alistair MacIntyre in his great work After Virtue, which is arguing in many respects for the same thing as Lewis, but in greater depth, at greater length. MacIntyre observes how in our present culture, differences of view have become incommensurable. Because we have no agreed standard of the objectivity of value, we can't measure one viewpoint against another. They're incommensurable. There's no common yardstick against which diverse perspectives can be reckoned. And for as long as these differences are considered not terribly important, there can be a celebration of diversity. We hear a lot about diversity these days as a good thing in and of itself, and obviously there's a lot of truth in that. But once diversity reveals its inability to arbitrate serious disputes, the pendulum then swings away from diversity to the opposite pole. Hence, and now I'm quoting Alistair MacIntyre, hence it's easy to understand why protest becomes a distinctive moral feature of the modern age, and why indignation is a predominant modern emotion. The self-assertive shrillness of protest arises because the facts of incommensurability ensure that protesters can never win an argument. The indignant self-righteousness of protest arises because the facts of incommensurability ensure equally that the protesters can never lose an argument either. Hence, protest is characteristically addressed to those who already share the protesters' premises. Protesters rarely have anyone else to talk to but themselves. This is not to say that protest can't be effective. It is to say that it cannot be rationally effective, and that its dominant modes of expression give evidence of a certain, perhaps unconscious awareness of this. That's MacIntyre in After Virtue, and that just chimes so well with what Lewis is outlining and indeed predicting in the pages of The Abolition of Man. Let me finish with my own two final paragraphs of this chapter, chapter 6. The pervasive, the almost ubiquitous acceptance of subjectivism in modern Western culture means there can never be any persuasion, that is to say, rational argument leading to a freely adopted change of mind. Rather, as objective value evaporates and the public square is evacuated of practical moral reason, what passes for ethical discourse increasingly resembles a war zone in which political propagandists, commercial interests, private whims, and animal instincts fight tooth and nail in a permanent free-for-all. The leaders and the led, the rich and the poor, the white collar and the blue collar, the religious and the secular, these parties look at one another with a rivalry bordering on hatred or simply with blank incomprehension. In this rational desert, the only way people can effect social or political or legislative change is to mobilize a sufficiently large contingent of like-minded protesters and out-protest their opponents. The question of truth, as such, is relegated to a second or third order issue. The real question is one of power, and thus we arrive at our post-truth world. The term post-truth was declared the Oxford Dictionary's word of the year in 2016. Post-truth is an adjective defined as relating to or denoting circumstances in which objective facts are less influential in shaping public opinion than appeals to emotion and personal belief. That's the definition, and observe how in that definition the split between facts and feelings is perpetuated. For as long as facts and feelings remain disconnected from each other, even opposed to each other, the relevance of the abolition of man will continue. David and Marge, do you have any questions for me?
Thank you, Michael, for your, well, just very helpful as well as stimulating comments. So everyone will be rushing out to get your book very quickly, I hope. So, and just a reminder to everyone that I'll pose a question first and then David will have one. And in the meantime, if you have questions for Michael, please type them into the Q&A box, not the chat box. And we will be passing those along to Michael. Michael, in your chapter on the intellectual legacy of the abolition of man, you make the important observation, and here I'm quoting you, objectivity is real and accessible, but subjectivity is also real and not entirely escapable, nor should we want to escape it entirely, for we have value as subjects, end of quote. Now, it seems that most often individuals either tend to exalt the subjective completely above an objective, the subjective completely above an objective understanding of reality, or else they lean towards dismissing the value of subjectivity altogether. You offer a much more balanced approach. Could you elaborate upon this and why it is an important perspective?
Thank you, Marge. Yes, that is, I think, one of the most important things of Lewis's whole argument, that he's trying to get over the too stark opposition or distinction between subject and object, just as he is trying to overcome the opposition between facts and values. Objectivity exists. That's the burden of his argument, but he's not overbalancing and coming up, as it were, the other side without any residual respect for subjectivity. In the course of his argument, he quotes Shelley, the Romantic poet Shelley. I've got a photograph of him too in the photo gallery. Shelley, like C.S. Lewis, was a student sometime at University College, Oxford. And Lewis observes that Shelley, having compared the human sensibility to an Aeolian lyre, you know, that harp that is played by the wind, Shelley goes on to add that human sensibility differs from that lyre in having a power of internal adjustment, whereby it can accommodate its chords to the motions of that which strikes them. So the wind blows through a harp and the harp just resonates as a result. But when we as human beings interact with the external world, we have intelligence, we have inquisitiveness, we have value as subjects, in other words. So we're not just dumb recipients, we're not just blank slates upon which the external world writes itself, No, we can rationally assess the objects which meet our senses and adapt our thoughts and feelings in light of what we perceive. Lewis dramatizes this point in That Hideous Strength, where the villains of the piece, the villainous headquarters of the National Institute of Coordinated Experiments, they're trying to eradicate the specifically human emotions in Mark Studdock in a room which is called the objective room. And the villains keep harping on achieving total objectivity, complete objectivity, utter objectivity, which sounds all, you know, as if it might be right up Lewis's street. But on the contrary, no, this is what the villains want. This complete, utter, absolute objectivity denies our value as human persons and our own our own good subjectivity, which is different from subjectivism. If you'll pardon another quotation, I'm going to quote the words of Paul Holmer in his book C.S. Lewis, The Shape of His Faith and Thought. Now, this is another reason I have to thank the Wade Center, because as I was putting this guide together, the words of Chris Mitchell came to mind, of course, longtime director of the Wade Center and a beloved friend of many of us. And I always remember Chris praising this book very highly. Paul Holmer, C.S. Lewis, The Shape of His Faith and Thought. It's an early book, 1970s, one of the earliest books on C.S. Lewis. And it's been out of print for many years and is not terribly well known. But because Chris had praised it so highly, I thought I'd better go and reread what Paul Holmer has to say about the abolition of man. And I found some very helpful paragraphs. And let me just read two of them, which speak absolutely to your question, Marge. Paul Holmer says this: "We are so accustomed to highly contrived accounts of the moral life and to having our thoughts everlastingly described as objective, if we're having to do with facts, and subjective, if we're considering values, that we can scarcely gather in the drift of Lewis's ideas. Not for a moment is Lewis denying that there is a world around us that, in an obvious sense, is there to be known and described. On the other hand, Lewis is not denying that people are people, that we are typically the ones who have the ideas, the emotions, the purposes. In this sense, we are subjects, not objects. The difference is that Lewis will not concur with the notion that the language of science is uniquely objective. Furthermore, he rejects categorically the view that there is only one literal language that reproduces the structures of the world. There is no norm in one kind of language that is particularly factual and about the world, whereas all other ways of speaking are more or less subjective." Holmer goes on, "This must be said with great care. Lewis is not one to deny the advantage of technical language for its given purposes, but he denies the philosophical notion called positivism, which suggests a singular kind of discourse that is factual. Partly this is so because Lewis knows both the ambiguity of the concept fact and the many ways in which words work. There prove to be many ways of speaking about what is. The fact-value distinction is therefore abrogated. Seeing facts is not an exclusive prerogative of any one discipline. The world has no single character, and it must be understood in a variety of ways. To read it with everything moral and aesthetic abstracted out of it is to make it a caricature of itself. To read it with those factors admitted is to see the very logic and sense of the world." That's Paul Holmer, and I think that really gets to Lewis's point about the value of subjectivity, even in a world of objective value.
Thank you for that very helpful and thorough answer, Michael. Paul Holmer was not only an early Lewis scholar, but he was the very first person that Dr. Kilby ever invited to speak at the Wade Center.
Was he? Excellent. I didn't know that. Marvelous.
David, I think you have a question for Michael.
Well, you mentioned that hideous strength. I think I'll follow up on that question. When I see the capital C conditioners discussed in that the Abolition of Man, I can't help but think of that hideous strength. In his preface to that novel, the third of the Ransom trilogy, he says, this is a tall tale about devilry, but I'm trying to make a serious point, which I've developed more fully in my book, The Abolition of Man. So my question is, for readers who want to understand and appreciate that hideous strength more fully, what do you think they should draw from that Abolition of Man to help them understand the novel more fully?
Yes, indeed. It was very difficult in writing this guide to the Abolition of Man not to make it simultaneously a guide to that hideous strength.
Right, I can see.
And I tried to resist the gravitational pull towards the novel. I do inevitably make a fair number of cross-references and point people to the novel at various times, partly for the sake of illuminating the novel, but partly also for the sake of reflective illumination upon the abolition of man, because sometimes it's easier to see Lewis's ideas when they're dramatized and enacted. Well, perhaps the main way in which that hideous strength becomes clearer, the main way that that hideous strength becomes clearer in light of the abolition of man is when we understand what Lewis is doing in the abolition of man with his model of the human person divided into three parts: the head, the chest, and the belly. His argument is that the head rules the the head rules the belly through the chest. In the head, we have rational thoughts. We are cerebral. We are rational. In the belly, we have sensations and passions. From the neck up, you might say we're angelic. From the belly down, we're animal. In the chest, we are anthropological. It's the chest, which is the liaison officer between spiritual man and visceral man. And it's this chest which is the place of stabilized sentiments, just civilized sentiments, that human beings become truly human beings. We shouldn't want to drive out our passions and our emotions. We shouldn't want to become purely logical brains on sticks, as it were. We should be trying to unite these two aspects of ourselves. We are rational animals. That's a classic definition of what it is to be human. But in that hideous strength, the villains of the piece think, no, the only good thing is utter objectivity, complete objectivity, total objectivity, which they associate with the head, with the rational, logical thoughts, because they despise the body. And as a result, they take the head, the decapitated head of a French criminal, and they attach it to a bracket, they pin it on a wall, they connect various tubes and bladders to it and feed it with fluids and try to keep it alive artificially. And eventually they bow down before it in a kind of devilish worship. This has become their god. It's obscene, it's outrageous what they're trying to do. And Lewis paints the horror of it very, very powerfully in that hideous strength. But at the same time as the villains are doing this, elsewhere in their headquarters, they have an extensive zoo full of elephants and tigers and snakes. And the climax of the novel, of course, when they're bowing down to the head, the animals are let loose and chaos ensues. You know, the natural law asserts itself. Natural justice is wreaked upon these violators of natural goodness, truth, and beauty. So all of that, which might seem a little bit excessive and puzzling in that hideous strength, becomes a good deal more understandable in the light of the abolition of man. And there are many other similar things which I could go on for at great length, but I hope one example, one significant example is sufficient in this connection.
Yeah. Thank you, Michael. You have stirred up a lot of questions. I'm going to try to get to them as many as I can, combine a few here and there. This one is from Steve Beebe. Do you think that it is significant that Lewis uses a book titled The Control of Language, although he calls it the Green Book, to introduce his ideas? Do you see links between Lewis's key ideas in the abolition of man and our use of words and language to discover meaning and make sense out of the world?
Yes, thank you, Steve Beebe. The the opening target of The Abolition of Man is a book that in reality was called The Control of Language. Lewis gives it the name The Green Book. He hides its identity, and indeed the identity of its authors, Alec King and Martin Ketley, behind pseudonyms. Partly because, well, I think he just didn't think very much of those writers, those thinkers, and partly perhaps because he didn't want to give it any more publicity than it already received. But here is The Control of Language. And there are King and Ketley, Gaius and Titius. Many thanks to the Wade Center for the permission to reproduce The Control of Language cover. And I got Gaius and Titius from New College and Keble College, Oxford, respectively. They were students at Oxford, both of them reading classics in the 1920s. And it's quite possible they actually went to some of Lewis's lectures when he was first beginning his career as an academic, teaching philosophy for a year. So yes, they, in The Control of Language, are attempting to strengthen children, school children, against propaganda, against being swayed by false emotion. The only problem is that they equate false emotion and emotion. They don't allow that there's good emotion, that feelings can sometimes be in accord with reality, and therefore they are determined to eradicate sentiments from the people who read their book, the children that they're training up, rather than training them into the acquisition of just and stable and civilized sentiments. That's the very simple error in logic that they make. Just because sentiments can be abused doesn't mean that there is no proper use for them. And one of the ways in which we come to trained and stable and civilized sentiments is through education, through moral upbringing, which happens not just in the home, but also in the schools, of course, and in any number of school textbooks that might be put in front of us, such as The Control of Language. And one of the reasons why The Control of Language attracts Lewis's ire so strongly is that it's smuggling in this kind of subjectivist philosophy without arguing for it. Behind The Control of Language lies the thought of I.A. Richards, Ivor Richards, whom Lewis does name in The Abolition of Man. Richards also argues for a kind of subjectivist philosophy, but in Richards, it's all open, it's all honest. There is error in it, Lewis thinks, but there's no crime. The crime of the writers of the Green Book is that they're smuggling in a textbook which is supposedly about reading and writing English, and actually they're feeding their young pupils a very deleterious and dehumanizing philosophy without properly explaining it or even avowing it. And this issues in the misuse of language in various ways. Just now finally getting to the nub of Steve's question about language. And in The Abolition of Man, Lewis talks about how subjectivism begins to corrupt our very language in various ways because we can't acknowledge value objectively in a serious way. We have to, but nonetheless it still exists, we have to find different ways of talking about it. And therefore we invent all sorts of euphemisms and circumlocutions as a way of saying what has to be said, but without attaching to it the value that ought to be attached. So yes, linguistic philosophy is a major strain of his argument in The Abolition of Man.
Michael, since you mentioned I.A. Richards, can you quickly tell the story of the night that Richards spent at Magdalen College with Lewis as his host?
Yes, that's very funny. So I.A. Richards was the constant subject of Lewis's attacks in various books. He's always, aiming broadsides at Richards. Richards was the author of a book called Principles of Literary Criticism, which Lewis names in the notes of The Abolition of Man and eviscerates. He really takes it to pieces. But Richards once came to Oxford to give a talk and C.S. Lewis was charged with putting him up overnight at Magdalen College. And when they got to the college at the end of the evening, Lewis suddenly realized, oh, he'd forgotten to book a room for Richards. But his colleague, R.G. Collingwood, was away, so he could stay in Collingwood's room. But there were no books for Richards to read. So Lewis said to Richards, you stay here, I'll go and get you a book so that you have something to, to while away the evening before you go to sleep. And he returned bearing his own copy of Richards's Principles of Literary Criticism. And Lewis said to him, here's something that should put you to sleep. But that's not where the joke really ends, because the sting in the tail is that Richards could not sleep because the margins of this copy were filled with Lewis's biting comments. So it's a beautiful kind of little tableau that you get there between these two men who I don't think knew each other very well. This might have been the only time they met. Richards was more of a Cambridge man than an Oxford man. And there's another nice little interaction between Lewis and some of his opponents, because he's not just bloviating against distant figures. He's talking about people he knew and met and argued with, sometimes at the Socratic Club, the debating society of which he was president. And one such figure was the philosopher A.J. Ayer, Freddie Ayer, who was a leading exponent of positivism. And Ayer came and debated at the Socratic Club with Lewis. And after this debate, Lewis described Freddie Ayer privately as a cross between a rodent and a firefly. And this rather tart comment got back to A.J. Ayer, and he commented, I did not feel altogether flattered, but I had some idea of what he meant. And here are the two men, I.A. Richards and Freddie Ayer. And yeah, hopefully having the faces of these men put in the guide will bring Lewis's argument to life a bit more. These are not just names on a page, that we can at last attach a face to them.
Yeah, thank you, Michael. There's been a lot of back and forth about the cover of the Green Book, and just as a short little anecdote, Dr. Kilby early on figured out somehow, I don't remember how, The Control of Language was the book, and he tracked down a copy in, I think, Australia, and it was at the Wade Center for many years, and it had a white cover. And so it was when the Wade Center actually acquired Lewis's library, and it had a green cover that we all said, oh. So this is a little bit of a follow-up to what you were just talking about from Landon Lofton. Do you see Lewis as being inconsistent in criticizing the authors of the Green Book for indirectly propagating their philosophy, subjectivism, through a textbook on literature, while in other places encouraging Christians to propagate Christianity by writing books on other subjects with their Christianity latent?
That's a very good question. And it's very close to a question that I have in the back pages of After Humanity, actually, because this is another thing we should perhaps mention, that the book is designed in part for professors and teachers who have courses in the abolition of man. So there are 30 plus questions for discussion at the end of the book. And one of these questions is very much the question that Landon has just asked about whether Lewis is being inconsistent. And well, there's a difference, I think, between latency and contraband. And I think that's probably the distinction that Lewis would try to use to defend himself on this point, that the subjectivism inherent in the philosophy of Gaius and Titius, Alec King and Martin Ketley, is not merely latent. It is smuggled in. It is poisoning the wells of their textbook. If only it were latent, because latency is not actualized. Latency is there as a kind of background, as a kind of implicit, unstated premise, but it's not fed to the author. And one of the reasons why Lewis argues that Christians should write books on other topics, not just Christianity, but with their Christianity latent, is that it will raise the public reputation of Christian intellectuals. If every time you want the best book on biology, it turns out to have been written by a Christian, then you might begin to think, oh, well, there could possibly be something in Christianity. If you want the best book on architecture, and that happens to be written by a Christian, but without propagating Christianity, you may begin to think, oh, perhaps there's something in Christianity. So I think that's a real distinction between latency and infection. I think at any rate that's probably how Lewis would attempt to defend himself.
Although just to complicate the argument, after he wrote Out of the Silent Planet, Lewis wrote to Sister Penelope, his friend, and said, "You'll be amused to hear that only 2 reviewers out of 60 were aware of a Christian worldview behind the fiction Out of the Silent Planet." And he says, "I suppose any amount of theology can be smuggled into men's minds under the guise of romance without their knowing it." So
Yes.
he's willing to do a little smuggling of his own, at least in his fiction.
Oh yeah, well, I think that's another important distinction, the distinction between a work of fiction and a work of textbooks for use in schools. That an adult novel, or indeed for that matter, a children's novel like the Narnia books, is a work of art. It's of course going to communicate any number of values that are important to the author, and the idea that you can have valueless fiction is naive in the extreme. All art is propaganda, as George Orwell famously said. All art is propaganda. Not all propaganda is art. And T.S. Eliot said, didn't he, that all art influences us whether we intend to be influenced or not, and all artists influence us whether they intend to or not. So the idea that you can read any novel without imbibing some kind of inherent latent worldview smuggled in more or less deliberately as it may be, that's naive. But that's a very different thing, I think, from works of educational pedagogical use, like the control of language. That is a different matter.
Thank you. I'm going to remind everyone now that they have the great privilege, thanks to Michael's publisher, Word on Fire Academic. And by the way, it is a beautifully done book, not only beautifully written and researched and with all the insights that Michael's already been sharing with you, but it's just a lovely book. But Word on Fire Academic has donated 2 copies of Michael's book, as well as 2 copies of the accompanying Abolition of Man that viewers will be able to get. And this is how you can be in the raffle. Email wade@wheaton.edu and put in your subject line, "After Humanity Book Giveaway." So that's wade@wheaton.edu. And the subject line is "After Humanity Book Giveaway." We'll give you a few minutes to write in, and we will announce the winners in just about 10 minutes or so. But in the meantime, we'll keep Michael busy. Stephen Bretson has a question about how do you help your students understand the appendix to the Abolition of Man?
Thank you. Yes, the appendix to the Abolition of Man consists of 8 rules or laws, moral laws, such as the law of general beneficence, the law of special beneficence, duties to ancestors and elders, duties to children and posterity, the law of veracity, the law of justice, and law of mercy and magnanimity. Those are the 8 categories which he uses as a kind of structuring device for his overview of any number of cultures and traditions and schools of thought across the world and down through history. He quotes Australian Aboriginal, Native American, Ancient Egyptian, Babylonian, Hindu, Jewish, Christian, any number of traditions he quotes in support of these various moral laws. And this is one of the ways in which he suggests, he's not arguing at this point, this is just supporting evidence that that moral value is objective, because so many different traditions from so many different perspectives have come to remarkably similar conclusions about all these things. Even absolutely universal common consent would not prove the objectivity of value, Lewis argues. The objectivity of value is self-evident. It has to be accepted as a premise. It's not a conclusion. This is the ground that we stand on in order to make any moral judgments whatsoever. This is one of the slightly perplexing things about Lewis's argument, that he's arguing for a premise, really. He's not arguing to a conclusion. So the universal testimony in favor of the Tao doesn't prove it, but it helps suggest that Lewis might be onto something. And the very fact that he doesn't rest everything on Christian sources, or Judeo-Christian sources for that matter, is very interesting. He seems almost deliberately to reduce the number of biblical quotations that he might have inserted into this appendix, which again speaks to my point about the Abolition of Man not being a work of Christian apologetics, at least not directly. Of course, you can get from his position in the Abolition of Man to a Christian position, but he doesn't take it there in these pages. If you want to see how he does take it there, the best thing to do is just to continue reading past the first 4 chapters of Mere Christianity. That's when he makes the segue into, first of all, theism and then into Christianity.
Thank you.
I see here that we have our winners of the raffle. Those of you who signed in would like a free complimentary copy, not only of The Abolition of Man, but of course of this wonderful commentary, After Humanity, with matching covers. And the 2 winners are Alec King and Martin Ketley. I'm so happy that they could tune in, because they probably need further explanation of why their ideas were, excuse me, that's not correct. Let me look more closely. The winners of the book drawing are Steve Bretson and Alyssa Kay. So if you would give your contact information, you can also send that into thewade@wheaton.edu, and we'd be happy to send those books out to you as a complimentary reward for tuning into this really interesting discussion. We're coming up on 5 o'clock. Dr. Ward has graciously agreed to stay after the hour if you have some questions that you would still like to pose to him. So let's go ahead and ask Michael a few more questions. I did want to ask you about this title. I had a student who thought The Abolition of Man must be part of the space trilogy because it sounded so apocalyptic. He could have used, rhetorically, he could have used the poison of subjectivism, which he used in an essay. Do you think there's a conscious hyperbole or sort of rhetorical drama to the title, The Abolition of Man? And tell us about your title, After Humanity, which also could have a rather apocalyptic connotations. So talk about Lewis's title and about your title of your commentary.
Yes, The Abolition of Man is a very dramatic, dystopic, alarmist title, isn't it? And that might be, I suspect, one of the reasons why Lewis gives The Abolition of Man such a very dry and dusty subtitle. Subtitle being Reflections on Education with Special Reference to the Teaching of English in the Upper Forms of Schools. What a dry mouthful. And I think, the contrast between the alarmist title and the excessively lengthy, dry subtitle is probably designed to reassure people that this is not just a work of dystopic fiction. Anyway, why have I called my book After Humanity? 3 reasons. First of all, because if subjectivism leads to the abolition of man, then we reach a post-human future. Lewis uses the term post-humanity himself in the course of his argument. So after humanity speaks to that aspect of his argument. A second reason connects with my belief that there is indeed a latent Christianity even in this avowedly philosophical and non-theological work. And that is in the appendix, because the very final quotation that Lewis gives in the appendix is from the Gospel of John, where he cites Jesus saying, unless a grain of wheat die, it remains alone, but if it dies, it bears much fruit. And that's the note on which the abolition of man ends. And I think that's not an accident. I think Lewis is quietly suggesting, for those with ears to hear, that if it's to Jesus Christ that we should look if we are really seeking after humanity, because Jesus himself is the highest epitome of what it means to be human. He is truly the human being fully alive, who is the glory of God. So that's a kind of punning meaning to after humanity. And then thirdly, after humanity is a nod to Alistair MacIntyre. I quoted him earlier and his great book, After Virtue. I think there are connections to be made between the abolition of man and after virtue. And I'm not the first person to have said this. Basil Mitchell, the philosopher who succeeded C.S. Lewis as the president of the Oxford Socratic Club, Basil Mitchell himself says that Alistair MacIntyre's book comes to precisely the same conclusion as Lewis's on this subject of the objectivity of value. And indeed, MacIntyre, although he doesn't refer to the abolition of man in After Virtue, he does refer to C.S. Lewis a couple of times, to Lewis's essay on Jane Austen and Jane Austen's own firm moral sense. I think Lewis and MacIntyre agree very much about Jane Austen as perhaps the last exponent of this ethical tradition, which both men are trying to describe philosophically. So those are the three reasons why it's called After Humanity.
Good.
Thank you, Michael. Here's a question from Ted Lewis. At the end of Abolition, Lewis makes some rather warm statements about Goethe and Steiner as if their view of science can provide a corrective to the modern viewpoint. Certainly, Barfield's influence on Lewis is shining here. Any more thoughts on this?
Yes, it's interesting how Lewis phrases those comments. I think the last few pages of the third chapter of The Abolition of Man are a little bit uncharacteristic in Lewis. I think he's projecting a future which is not entirely certain, and he doesn't seem to be entirely certain about what he's even asking for. Indeed, he uses that very phrase. I'm what does he say? I'm not entirely sure what I'm asking for here. And he talks about the rumors that he has heard about Goethe and Dr. Steiner. And that word rumors is very carefully chosen, I think, because he's there. This is called secondhand. I don't know for sure that Goethe and Steiner have got something to say on this matter, but I think it might be so. People I respect tell me so. And clearly he's alluding there to Owen Barfield and possibly to A.C. Harwood too, two anthroposophist friends of his who were greatly into Goethe and Steiner. But I think we shouldn't put too much weight on those nods in that direction because they're very conditional. They're very sort of provisional, I think. And indeed, when Lewis was asked to speak a little bit more plainly about his thoughts on Steiner and anthroposophy, he said, "I reject, insofar as I understand them, the philosophy and theology of Dr. Steiner and the anthroposophical movement." So even there, insofar as I understand them, I think Lewis himself was not entirely clear what anthroposophy was all about. But he trusted Barfield, he liked Barfield. So if Barfield thought it was good, there probably was something good in it. but he doesn't get into the details of it.
Thank you. Question from Michael Jabowski. He writes, you mentioned on page 42 of your book that there can be no persuasion given the pervasive, almost ubiquitous acceptance of various kinds of emotism and subjectivism in modern Western culture. Granted this, how should Christian educators in particular, like myself, attempt to persuade our students of the reality and necessity of objective morality?
Oof. It's after 11 at night here in England. Oh my word. That's a question we could have spent the whole hour on and more. I don't know.
We'll give you a pass on that one, Michael.
Well, I'll make a faint stab at an answer, but it's not going to be very coherent, I'm afraid. How can we begin to rebuild in this new dark age to sort of channel after virtue and Alistair McIntyre here? Well, I don't think that Lewis would want the new Benedict option of retreating into anything like a ghetto. But if you were to, as it were, retreat into a monastery, which is different from a ghetto, which is deliberately, as it were, somewhat separate from the world for the sake of the world, I think he might go along with that, the Benedictine option from that point of view. And therefore, yes, have Christian schools, have homeschooling, train up the child in the way that he should go, and when he is old, he will not depart from it. So, yeah, give your children the best that you can. Show them that, and not just your own children, but any pupils or children that you come into contact with. Show them that you yourself recognize the objectivity of value. It's our own example which will have more effect than any words or books that we produce. And how do we show that we ourselves accept the objectivity of value? One way, I think possibly the chief way, is that we accept that we may have to suffer for the objectivity of value. Hence, the experimentum crucis, the death for a good cause, that it's sweet and fitting to die for one's country. Just because you suffer for a belief does not make it wrong. This is a hugely, hugely important point, that if we try to pretend that no, the right must always win, then we're allowing right and might to be confused. We're collapsing might into right. But the losing side in an issue may nonetheless be the right side. And so we should be prepared to suffer for objective values and not think that we can always prevail. So modeling, exemplifying courageous self-sacrifice, I think, is probably the chief way in which we can model the objectivity of value.
Here's a very quick one.
Go ahead.
How young do you think someone can profitably study this book? And someone from the American context saying high school, that would be your prep school. What age do you think?
Well, the abolition of man itself on its own, I think, is very hard to understand if you're younger than 14, and a bright 14-year-old at that. 16 or 18, I think, is probably going to be more likely for most people. And even then, they'll find it tricky. With the helps provided by After Humanity, I hope to be able to bring down that age barrier somewhat. But even After Humanity requires a certain level of education and training. I don't know, it all depends on the child, doesn't it? I mean, my own book, Planet Narnia, which is written at a sort of PhD level, has been read and enjoyed by a 9-year-old. I know that. But he's a very remarkable 9-year-old. And, there are people with PhDs of their own who find it impenetrable. So it all depends.
Yeah, thank you. David, I have one more question I could throw at Michael, but I'm wondering if you have something.
No, that's fine. Why don't you go ahead and ask your question, and we should probably wrap things up and let Michael go to bed here.
That's what I was thinking. Yep. So what did you find most interesting, or what was most fun for you to discover when you were working on abolition, on this book for Abolition of Man?
Yes, thank you. I think one of the things I most enjoyed was beginning to trace out that connection, that link between Lewis's own wartime experience in the First World War and this dulce et decorum est pro patria mori statement, sweet and fitting to die for one's country argument that he advances in the Abolition of Man. I think that's lots of people have talked about the social and personal impact of Lewis's wartime experience and his friendship with the Moore family, but not many people seem to have paid much attention to the philosophical impact of that on him. So that's one thing I found particularly interesting and valuable, I hope. But perhaps the most pleasing thing of all was that in the archives of the University of Durham, I turned up the original blurb that C.S. Lewis himself wrote for the Abolition of Man, which has never been published before, which nobody else seems ever to have unearthed. Not even Walter Hooper seems to have known about it. And I managed to get permission from both the University of Durham and the C.S. Lewis estate to reproduce it in this book. And there it is in Lewis's own handwriting, 1943, you see there. And here's the transcript of it, in case you can't read his hand. So that, I think, is possibly the most exciting discovery from a kind of documentary and archival point of view. I'm really proud to have not only unearthed it, but to have got permission to reproduce it. To be honest, it's not a very good blurb, and you can see why it was never used. But nonetheless, it's interesting to see how Lewis at least attempted to describe his own book.
Yeah. Well, thank you. That's a wonderful note to end on. And Michael, it's always a joy to see you, even if it is only via Zoom. I hope to see you back in Wheaton before too long, though. And for all of you who have not had the pleasure of reading After Humanity, it is a treasure trove of just superb research, analysis, and understanding. You'll enjoy it, but you'll benefit from it even more. So thank you so much, Michael, for your time today, and we look forward to seeing you.
Yes, and you. Thank you, Marge. Thank you, David. Thank you, Laura behind the scenes, and Mary Lynn too, and everyone at the Wade and at Wheaton. God bless you.
Sleep well.
Thank you all for joining us.